Hi, I'm Dan Poblocki. You are listening to Our First Fears, a podcast about gateway horror, past and present, with artists working in the genre today. I'm back. It's been a while, almost a whole year. You see, after I spoke with Daniel Kraus last year, I realized I had a whole bunch of deadlines coming up and I needed to take a break. I had 3 books to write at the beginning of 2024, and I did that basically from December of 2023 until June of 2024, and I was exhausted and wiped out. 2 of the 3 books were novels, and they're almost done completely. So yeah, I did it. But these episodes take so much time to produce. I have to prep, and then I have to edit and mix the sound, and then create promo images, and I do this all by myself. I hope to keep making more episodes because I love having these conversations, but really I'll only be able to do it when I have time. Mental health, burnout, etc., blah, blah, blah. Anyway, the one book that I can announce on here so far, one that I'm really excited about, super excited about, is my first picture book, and that's coming out next summer from Penguin Workshop. It's called My Brother's Butt is Haunted, and it has pictures by James Ray Sanchez, and it's so funny and so cute, and I can't wait to let you know when it's available for pre-order. The other 2 novels haven't been announced officially, but when they are, I'll tell you about those too. I'm joined today by Eliot Schrefer, author of the recent science fiction novels The Darkness Outside Us and The Brightness Between Us, and they're 2 of my favorite reads of the past year, honestly, just mind-blowing. And we're talking about James Cameron's 1986 action horror classic, Aliens, which I've watched at least 20 times. The film was a blast to revisit, and especially to dig in with Eliot, who's just so intelligent and thoughtful and funny, which shouldn't be surprising to anyone since he's a 2-time National Book Award finalist and a Printz honor recipient for his YA nonfiction book, Queer Ducks and Other Animals. He was kind enough to chat while Hurricane Milton was bearing down on Florida, and you might even be able to hear the wind howling on his end. Now, turn down the lights, turn up the volume, and get ready to explore Our First Fears. Hey, Eliot, thanks so much for coming on to Our First Fears. How you doing?
Thank you, Dan. I'm super excited to talk to you.
Me too. You are currently in the midst of waiting on Hurricane Milton to arrive, and I wishing you the best down there. And I thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me through this.
I have to say, it's like a really welcome distraction.
Yeah.
Because I've been wandering around my mom's condo, like bumping into her, like filling various things with water and just getting prepared. And it's very nice to do something else for an hour. So thanks for having me on.
I'm glad. I hope you fill a whole bunch of various things with water so that you have safe water supply.
Like decorative jugs from TJ Maxx that were never intended to have actual fluids in them are now filled. It's like sort of out of Signs, that M. Night Shyamalan movie where there's like little vessels of water everywhere. So if the aliens attack.
You know, to sort of tie that into what we're going to be talking about today, it's about being prepared for possible isolation.
Yeah, I was looking at my e-reader this morning. Like, is this a priority? And it is a priority.
Yes.
I've decided it is.
Yes, it is. We can talk about psychology of being alone and all that stuff because it relates to the topic that you chose to bring to the podcast, which is the film Aliens. Before we get into that, for our listeners, could you introduce yourself and your work and your relationship to the horror genre, if you even have one?
Yeah. I've been writing YA middle grade novels for maybe 15 years. Most recently, I wrote The Darkness Outside Us and its follow-up, The Brightness Between Us, which just came out. And those are science fiction novels that have a gay romance in their center. So I, for the first time, entered the romance genre just by accident of writing that story. And then I also, there's horror elements. I mean, you're the true horror expert, so you can tell me what percentage of horror it counts as. I'm kind of curious, actually, what you think. But definitely, I've had some people say, you know, this is my first time reading a romance, it's my first time reading a sci-fi, or it's the first time reading a horror novel. And I was surprised, especially by the third one. I didn't really think of it as that. but I guess it's,
Well,
I think life is horrifying sometimes. So like anytime I write about life, it's horrors involved.
no, it's interesting because I wasn't anticipating reaching out to you to talk to you about horror, but I was so horrified by the books that I was like, this is appropriate. I'm kind of happy to hear that other people have mentioned the word horror to you regarding these books, even though they are not just that. There are so many things.
Yeah, I feel like for me, every book should be a thriller, even if it's not officially in the thriller category. Like every book should be thrilling to read. And sometimes that thrill, I think, comes from aspects of horror. There's, this ship is sealed up and traveling through space. And these two boys don't know if they can trust each other. They don't know if they can trust the ship. And there is no escape to find out what the truth is. You can't open a door and go outside to get a perspective or ask someone else, because if you do that in space, you're dead. You're in the vacuum of space. Mm-hmm. So I think that to me is it's kind of like conceptually horrifying, even if there aren't zombies coming through the ship. There is this feeling of, oh my gosh, like that version of the original Alien had the tagline, in space, no one can hear you scream. And it's kind of like in space, no one can tell you what's true, is what these boys are going through. And I guess does feel horrifying to me. And I've always had this feeling of kind of a matrixy feeling throughout my own life of, what if it's not real? What if this is actually not the existence we think it is? And we are either in a simulation, we're a brain in the vat, that our perception of reality isn't true. That's always kind of haunted me, I guess, my whole life. And this was a way to work through some of those feelings.
I know your work as like very varied. And so it was surprising when I saw these books, sci-fi and romance, coming from you, and this surprise element of horror, which I don't think is really part of the marketing for the book, and it doesn't necessarily need to be. Tell us a little bit about your other work.
Yeah, so I think I started by writing for adults. I wrote 2 contemporary novels for an adult audience, and then I got invited to write YA for Scholastic. This is a long time ago, and I switched over to writing for young people at that point, and it kind of changed my whole writing trajectory. I became, I think, a better writer. I was writing for this different audience that wasn't me. And before that, I had been writing for other adults, or even just writing to impress friends and family, which is a terrible experience as a reader when you suspect that the author is not about you. It's about the author's own experiences and their own reputation. Like, it's the same experience of, like, going on a date and they talk about themselves the whole time. Like, no, this should actually, as a reader, you think like this should actually be about me. And I think when I started writing for younger readers, I became a more generous writer, I think. And I've never really looked back. And so I've written a series of young adult novels. We call them the Great Ape Quartet, because it's one about each species of great ape. And then some middle grade books called, one series is called The Lost Rainforest. Another one's The Animal Rescue Agency. And then I have my first picture book coming out next year. So there's a definite theme in those of animals and looking at non-human lives and experiences. Because I really love the feeling I get when I sort of get over humans and ourselves. I think it's funny. Sometimes I look at a shelf of books and I'm like, all our stories are about humans, which makes sense because we are humans, but there are other stories out there of non-human experiences. And one of my foundational reading experiences was reading Jane Goodall's memoirs about her time in Tanzania with the chimps, and just seeing these non-human characters realistically portrayed that have these like Shakespearean stories, this rise and fall of heroes and villains, and but these are not humans. And that's, instead of feeling that that's kind of makes me feel neglected, I feel sort of energized by that feeling that there are all these stories out there, and that maybe everything that matters to me or I'm worried about isn't as consequential as I'm suspecting, because there's so much more out there.
It's interesting to hear you say that. I want to get back to that notion sort of maybe near the end of the conversation, but we have a whole lot to talk about before I want to dive back into those ideas. I ask the guests who come onto the podcast also another question, and that's, do you recall the first time you ever felt frightened?
I do. I let's see, I was living in Cheshire, Connecticut. We moved a lot when I was a kid, so I can always figure out how old I was at the time by where I was living. I was in Cheshire, Connecticut, which means I was in kindergarten. There were neighbors down the road, and they had a VCR, which was really rad in the mid '80s. Like this idea that you could actually like have a recording and watch it, and it was in color. Like we didn't have any of those things, and I would go to their house and we would watch whatever videos they had on hand. And Bethany was the one who was my friend. She was my age, but there was an older sister, Charlotte, who had a recording of Thriller by Michael Jackson on VHS. And we watched it, and it was absolutely horrifying. It was my first experience of werewolves, of the feeling of like being in danger and pursued. I wasn't sure who to root for because like Michael Jackson's turning into a werewolf. It was so kind of scary and unnerving and really compelling, but lived in my mind for days afterwards. Like I would just be reliving all these moments from the video. And now looking at it as an adult, like I have no experience of fear watching Thriller. It's only sort of like cutesy cheeseball and a little bit, camp. But yeah, as a kindergartner, I was only scared by that.
I remember that. I remember being fascinated by the video because it felt so different from some of the other videos that were being played on MTV. It felt like a short film, So you got the music part going on and the dancing, and then like literally the song stopped and the story went on, and it was just like a fantasia of horror that they created.
Yeah, it's kind of a cool instinct. Yeah, because it seems like Michael Jackson really could have just centered himself a little bit more. Like it could have just been about how good a singer and dancer he is. And he is, in that video, an amazing singer and dancer. But by telling a story, it's kind of like the point is less directly on the star and more on, here's a cool story that I can tell through my music, which was kind of a cool impulse.
I think for me, watching that, there were parts... I mean, I was freaked out by the zombie makeup and then the werewolf transformation and his eyes at the end, the glowing eyes and the laughter of Vincent Price. But I think what sort of helped get me through a lot of the fear I might have been feeling was, I think, the attention that was given to the filmmaking and the makeup effects and behind the scenes stuff that MTV was playing in sort of, conjunction with the video that was playing. So they'd play the music and play the video, and then they'd also discuss what was going on with the director. I think John Landis directed it. So yeah, no, that's a really good one.
I love that. I just remember being scared by it, and you have like an IMDb page of Thriller in your mind. Well, you're interested in frame 28.
It's funny also because I remember listening to the song in my bedroom, even without the visuals of the video, allowing myself to get really freaked out by Vincent Price's rap and the elements of that. So it's funny where the brain can take you. I think I was more scared listening to the song by myself in my bedroom than I ever was watching the video on MTV. That's a good one though, Eliot. So thank you for sharing that part. But you brought the film Aliens to discuss. I think before we get into that, I usually like to give a little bit of like a credits rundown. In case anybody hasn't seen the movie, there's going to be a lot of, spoilers. I'm not going to hesitate. The movie's almost 30 years old at this point.
Yeah, you're too late if you're going to get spoiled now.
You're too late.
You should have watched it earlier.
Go see it and then come back if you haven't seen it. But it's a 1986 feature film directed by James Cameron, written by James Cameron with story credits by David Giler and Walter Hill, based on characters by Dan O'Bannon and Ronald Shusett. So it's a sequel to 1979's Alien by Ridley Scott. And this one's produced by Gail Ann Hurd, with executive producers Gordon Carroll, David Giler, and Walter Hill. And then a long cast, and I'm going to read them because we need some kind of frame of reference here. We have Sigourney Weaver as Ellen Ripley, who, Eliot, by the way, I just discovered was nominated for an Oscar for this movie.
For Aliens?
I don't know if you knew that, but yes.
Who'd she lose to?
How freaking cool.
Do you know who she
I
lost
don't know.
to?
I
Sure, it
don't
was
know.
Meryl
I'm
Streep.
gonna have to look it up.
Apparently, they were in Yale drama together, Meryl Streep and Sigourney Weaver. And rumor is that Meryl Streep got all the good parts every time, and Sigourney Weaver was very angry. So, if Meryl Streep won in '86, which seems likely, because when did Out of Africa come out? I'm sure Sigourney was in her feelings about it.
I remember hearing, this is just a complete divergent topic, but I remember hearing that Sigourney had been told that she wasn't going to be a star by teachers. Like maybe it was at Yale, maybe it was by Meryl Streep. I don't know. But I remember hearing that and thinking like, yes, badass, become like one of the highest paid actresses for your action franchise about aliens.
Totally. And I don't think Ripley had a first name in the first movie either. I'm going to let you finish, Dan.
Okay. No. Go on.
It's interesting that they added the name Ellen, because I believe in Alien, that part was written without consideration of gender, and was just known as Ripley throughout. And here in Aliens, she's cast as Ellen Ripley, but I don't have a memory in Aliens of them ever saying name Ellen. So I wonder if that was just for credit sequences or how that all came down.
But yeah, I do remember also the first film, it was written as non-gendered. It could have been anybody cast. And so I think that speaks to who she is and her talents, that they were just like, yeah, this woman can do it. We have Michael Biehn as Hicks, Carrie Henn as Newt, one of my favorite characters from the 80s in any movie. Mm-hmm. Lance Henriksen as Bishop, Paul Reiser as the slimeball Burke, Bill Paxton as the hilarious Hudson, William Hope as Gorman, Al Matthews as Apone, Mark Rolston as Drake, and Jeanette Goldstein as Vasquez, and I call them the muscle duo pals.
I love that for them.
Adding a little bit of queerness to this, the Marine,
absolutely
colonial Marine group.
One of my favorite parts of the movie is when they say to Vasquez, "Do you ever get mistaken for a man?" And she comes back with, "No, do you?" Which is, like sort of misogynist at its root, but it's also like a really great clapback for someone who is sort of masculine presenting.
There's some really good clapbacks in this, which kind of pushes it into queer territory.
Absolutely.
In a way. And we can talk a little bit more about that too. The creature design is by H.R. Giger, and the creature effects were supervised by John Richardson and a team of 40 practitioners. So that's the rundown for the credits. A long list. Now, Eliot, I'm going to ask you, if you don't mind, can you summarize the plot? Do you have a good way to sort of pitch this?
Yeah. Well, I guess if I were just in an elevator with someone, I would say it's just like alien mayhem on a colony on an exoplanet. But actual narrative sequence, let's think. So the movie is filmed 7 years after the original Alien, but 57 years have gone by, I believe. And Ripley, at the end of Alien, had closed herself and her cat into an escape pod to return to Earth. But they are pulled out of hyperspace at the beginning of this movie. And we meet Paul Reiser's character, whose name is Burke. Paul Reiser from Mad About You, but now we're like mad at him over the course of this movie because Burke is super squirrely. So she's woken up and Burke explains that they need her to go to a terraforming colony, which has been placed at the site where they first found the alien creatures in the first movie, Alien. And Ripley is shocked and astonished that they would have put a colony there on that planet, and it is horrifying to her, and she's suspicious. But since she's the one who knows about the aliens, she's the only one with firsthand experience. Everyone is doubtful about her story of what happened on the Nostromo, the original ship. But since she's the only one who claims to have experience with these aliens, she's sent to this colony to try to help and figure out what's going on, because it's gone silent. We've got no more signal from this terraforming colony. So we get the first time we have space marines, which there weren't any of those in the first movie, which was just, sort of freighter workers just trying to survive with an alien on their ship. Now we have gunpowder and like big devices that, as soon as you see them in the beginning, like, oh, they're going to use that in the final battle sequence, which is kind of a James Cameron trademark, because as soon as you see Avatar, you're like, oh, there's some like cool mining device. Of course they're going to be fighting with it 2 hours from now. Yeah, she meets all these, total dude-like 80s American, exclusively American Marines that are going to go and save the day and use all their gun power to fight. But they are able to land on the colony, and they discover that, yes, there is alien interaction with the humans. They find 2 live face huggers, I think, in the laboratory. But anyway, so they have to go and explore and find out what's happened to the colonists. And along the way, we find Newt, who's probably an 8-year-old girl, who somehow has survived this alien attack. And at first is very skittish and runs from Ripley and everyone else, but comes to find Ripley as sort of a mother figure to her. We find out that it's a really great constraint. I like applaud. James Cameron wrote the screenplay, I think. I applaud James Cameron for this, because they find out that the heat from gunfire is actually going to attract aliens. So the thing that these Marines were most confident in being able to use that could have saved the day is the thing that will cause them to be destroyed. Or no, it might breach the walls or cause a nuclear explosion. Yes. Right. That's it. So they have to really restrain from overt or extreme gunfire. And as they're exploring, they find that, yes, many of the colonists have been taken to a special area where they have been infected and are now gestating new aliens. And some really gruesome scenes there that really lodge deeply in my 3rd grade mind, still live there. Yeah, that there's, instead of just one alien, we have many, many aliens to deal with. The landing ship winds up having an alien that gets onto it and kills the pilots. And so it's really unclear how they're ever going to get off this colony. And ultimately, I think only Ripley and Bishop, the cybernetic person, survive with Newt and are able to leave this devastated colony. What did I miss?
Well, Hicks, Michael Bihn's character, survives as well.
Oh, poor Hicks.
Yep. Yeah, poor everybody, ultimately, but we can get into that as well later. Now, thank you for doing that. I'm curious to ask you why you picked this film. Do you remember how you came to it, like the first time you saw it? Like, why did this feel like the significant thing to talk to me about here?
Yeah, I think looking back, we actually had a kind of a dearth of horrifying things in my own home. My parents were not interested in things that were scary, and we didn't have any. And so this is another outside of my house experience, seeing aliens. And I'm realizing that plus thriller, like there's something that was extra horrifying about these things because I hadn't been exposed to them before. So it was another friend's house. I was in 3rd grade. And I remember going for a sleepover to Caleb's house, and aliens had just come out, and they had aliens on, and we all watched it with pizza and soda. And I think, there's a way in which there's one scene in particular when I was talking about the gestating colonists. There's one where there's a colonist has been sort of embedded into this wall that has just become alien tissue. And at first you don't even realize that a person is in there. And then like sort of you see a face and she moves and screams and just says, "Kill me." And she's kind of like just rupturing with it. Her like human tissue is sort of can't be distinguished from the alien tissue. And she just wants to be killed. And they do a mercy killing of this person. And that was just seared in my mind in a way that wasn't just like, oh, I will think back on this and get scared. It was the only thing that was like it is a few years ago, I was attacked by a dog. It wasn't too severe, but I did have like wounds on my arms. I still, for days afterwards, when I would go to sleep, especially, I'd close my eyes, and the first thing that would come from my brain was the remembered sense of that dog attack, the sharp feeling of the teeth, the extremeness of the sensation, and the fear that I was feeling. It wasn't like anything my reasoning brain was conjuring up. It was just like PTSD thing, I guess, like sort of return of a traumatic moment. And I actually felt that with the aliens thing, like that rupturing colonist would return to me. And I, without kind of unbidden, and just lived in my mind. And I think it's the deepness with which that fear got inside me, I think is why I thought it was significant and why I kind of was interested in talking about it and sharing it and figuring out like getting to the bottom of that. What happened to me, Dan? What happened?
Yeah. So it's the body stuff. It's the sort of takeover, the infiltration. That's intense. And that's really intense for a kid to sort of grapple with, I imagine. I remember that moment as being shocking and horrifying. Of course, I had not seen the first film when I saw Aliens.
I hadn't either.
So I didn't I didn't know that this is how they procreated or multiplied. You know, the face hugger implanting a seed inside the human torso, and then that thing growing rapidly and then bursting out. So seeing that, this poor person who knew what was coming, because they had seen it happen to all of their friends, family, and coworkers. What a wild thing to experience for the first time as a kid.
Yeah.
I think I was about 9 or 10 when I saw it. My family we were on vacation in New Hampshire, and one night HBO was something that we didn't have at home, and Aliens was going to be playing. So my brother and sister, probably more so my brother and me, begged my parents if we could watch. And they let us. We watched it all together, and I think probably more so than anything else, it was all the F words that my mom was like cringing about. But
That's funny.
Yeah, that moment was the one that just really set things off for what eventually would become like a roller coaster. The things that freaked me out as a kid, or like really I felt connected to, strangely, immediately, is the character of Newt. Like as a little kid, I think seeing a little kid in that situation, first of all, made me think she's a badass.
Totally.
I didn't have the language to put that together for myself, but I was like, she's a survivor. This is amazing. Look at what a little kid can do. I thought it was so cool that she had sort of like a nest in the walls that she had created for herself. And I was like, I want to live in the walls.
Yeah.
I want to bring all my toys and blankets and live in the walls or under the bed. It seemed really cool to me.
The movie was really willing to put her in danger really frequently in a way that I was used to kids in scary situations, like sort of being in a safe zone. Like, you stay here, we're going to go fight them, you know, but it was often Newt who was the direct recipient of attacks from face huggers or adult aliens.
And to Carrie Henn, the actress who played her, to her credit, she's a really good screamer. Totally. She's a good actor. She's a good actor too, but like she's a really good screamer.
And it's always Ripley's name, like Ripley. Ripley.
She has a few quotes from this movie that I will still say it to myself. I don't know if you remember this one, but like after there's a crash and a disaster, and they realize the group is going to have to stay on the planet a little bit longer than they planned. Newt says something to Ripley like, you know, we should get going because it's going to be night soon. And they mostly come at night. Mostly.
That is actually a very good rendition of her voice in that moment. Chills.
They mostly come at night. Mostly. I'll say that to myself. just to fall asleep. Just to crack myself up sometimes.
Yeah. What's interesting, because she was our age as we were watching, because I think we're similar ages. And there was a way in which it felt true to me, out of like, you know, like you have a kid in vulnerability. Like I felt like if something crazy happens, I'll like figure out like I'll go through the air vents. Like that was sort of like, I would imagine that for myself. And I remember once thinking as I was flying, if this plane crashes, I'll just like I'll be falling through the air and I'll look for a trampoline factory and I'll like land on a trampoline outside of the trampoline factory. And like, this didn't feel fantastical to my mind. It was like, this is actually like how I would save myself, is like finding a trampoline or falling from an aircraft. And
it makes sense.
Yes.
Yeah. Trampoline factory.
Totally. Just look out. But there's a way in which, of course, like to me, in my kid mind, the only survivor would be a kid, right? Because like me, she would find the trampoline factory or whatever the thing is that would help her survive in that moment. And there's also this, like, she can scurry in small spaces and she can keep herself alive.
Yeah. That's a lot of what it was, that first of all, she has a brother, right, who did not make it. And she's wily enough to scurry and find the places under the floors and those vents. And you know, near the end of the movie, she's directing the whole group which vent to turn to. Like she knows. She's been through it. And at the beginning of the movie, she looks like she's been through it. You know, her hair is all ratty. She's filthy. Her clothes, like who even knows what she's gone through? I know that there's a director's cut or a longer cut where she has some scenes at the beginning of the movie, and I don't recall. I think I saw it once, but she has some extra scenes at the beginning of the movie that set up what happens to her. But I think it's more effective that she just shows up and she looks like this. She looks like a a horror rag doll out of a nightmare.
Yeah.
And
on second viewing,
it's pretty
like
shocking.
I thought it was really accurate makeup early. And second viewing, she looks a little like an extra from production of Annie, you know? Like, it's a hard knock life.
I disagree. No,
you're not allowing this.
I don't accept
that. You
can
cut it in post, Dan. You can cut it in post.
No, I won't. But I will say she also has like a little totem that she carries around with her, Casey, her doll.
Oh, I forgot.
And all that's left of the doll is its head. And the head looks exactly like the way she looks. Filthy and ratty, blonde hair, and it's all matted. And it's terrifying. The fact that she clings to this doll head also sort of, I think, hints towards a larger story of like, where's the rest of the doll? How did that happen?
What was that moment? That's just left to your imagination too, right? And I think I love that, this is the only significant Michael Bain to one side, the only really significant emotional attachment Ripley gets in the first two movies entirely, like outside of the cat too in the first movie. But it's like she is through Newt, like she's finding this thing that by helping it survive, she will survive too. And you can see Newt doing the same thing to this smaller being, which is this doll who's now just a head.
Yes.
It's a nice thematic overlap that's going on there.
Oh yeah. A couple other things that stuck out to me as a kid were what happens to Bishop, the android character at the end. They think they escape. Bishop, all of a sudden they're together in the ship in outer space. They see acid dripping on the floor, and then all of a sudden Bishop is just like torn in two by the mother alien who has actually crept onto the ship and escaped with them. That white fluid pouring out of him, and then his innards, as he's only half a person left, dangling out of him, was just so gory and grotesque.
That fluid that was inside him, and I think the first time we see it is the reveal that he is not human on their first journey off to the colony. He's doing this knife trick where he can stick a knife between each of his fingers and back. And then at first it seems like, oh, this is just a really dexterous person. And then it gets so fast that it's just a blur and you realize like, oh no, this is not an actual human. And then he cuts himself a little bit and you see just a little bit of this android blood and it's white.
Yeah.
And the thing that stuck out of my mind as much as The Colonist, although it wasn't as scary, because we used to, like once a week at least, my mom would make Stouffer's chicken pot pie for dinner. And that sauce in the chicken pot pie was that exact like frothy consistency, slightly yellow, but mostly white color with a little gray undertone. And even like the little nuggets of, chicken and turkey, like it was pure Bishop that I was eating once a week.
Now, was this before or after you had seen the movie?
We were already eating it, and there was no way I was going to be able to opt out of continuing to eat it. So it was just like he was just filled with pot pie goo.
Just had to deal with it. And the last thing, sort of sticking on this theme, the last thing that sort of stuck with me as a kid were the face huggers, which, I was unfamiliar with how they worked from the first movie. And there's a scene where Ripley and Newt are sort of locked in a med lab with a couple of the face huggers. And that scene, so distressing. And even I rewatched the movie in pieces over the past couple weeks, and I got to that part again last night. And still gave me chills and shivers. It is so intense and so terrifying.
Well, their design, the facehugger design is just amazing. I mean, they have these kind of like witches' hands coming out from this body. And then this like,
that's a good way to put it,
voracious orifice. And then this like long tail with a sharp end. And they're super strong and super fast.
And filled with acid.
I mean, all the steps. And I love so once they actually get on someone's face and manage to constrict, take that tail and put it around their neck, they can't be removed because they'll tighten around the neck. So like narratively, it's just this amazing vice where the thing is small, right? So it seems like with enough power and time, and there is time because it takes it a while to fertilize whoever it's infecting, enough time you could get it off. But that constraint seems like just such a great way to make them so powerful and so much scarier because there might not be any return once one is on your face.
I love the way you describe it as witch's fingers for
kind of knuckly legs.
Yeah. It's the Giger design. He's a genius. Really sick stuff.
In the first movie, apparently Ridley Scott really insisted that the crewmate who got infected be male, not female, because it would have been too easy to have this sort of horror of impregnation with a female, and it would be this extra, especially for men watching, this idea of being forcefully impregnated as a male, especially, would seem like a violation of an order more extreme even than if that crewmate had been female.
It makes a lot of sense, and it leads to the next thing I wanted to mention, which is the conversation that Ripley and Newt have just before this sort of facehugger attack in the med lab. I have a little quote here because the conversation I just felt was so pointed and could mean a whole bunch of different kinds of things. I mean, we can talk about some of them. Newt says, as she's lying in bed and getting tucked in by Ripley, she says, "My mommy always said there were no monsters, no real ones, but there are." And Ripley says, "Yes, there are, aren't there?" Newt says, "Why do they tell little kids that?" And Ripley says, "Most of the time it's true." And having watched the film many times before and knowing what's coming, that moment, that dialogue feels so prescient and so terrifying and cruel, because ultimately what happens right after this is Paul Reiser's character, Burke. Ripley finds out that he was going to try and smuggle one of the facehuggers back to Earth to use as a bioweapon, show it to his company, get like a perk or whatever reward he would get for bringing this in. And Ripley's like, "No, you're not. You're not getting past me. I did some research. You sent these people into the ship. You knew that this was going to happen." He knows he's going to be in a whole bunch of trouble. And so he basically locks Ripley and Newt in the med lab with the facehuggers. So the question that sort of is raised by Newt and Ripley about there are no monsters, no real ones, but there are. It's, well, who is the real monster?
Yeah.
Is it the thing with claws, the thing that's trying to make more of itself, or is it the person who betrays? You know, it's a pretty obvious question. It's not like very deep.
Well, on the level of theme, I think when a book or a movie raises a question, like, depth isn't really sort of what it's about. It's like, is it kernely enough that different characters can have different opposite viewpoints around this question? And I think the sort of that manipulation and who is telling the truth is ultimately philosophically horrifying, like to the same level as the aliens are physically horrifying. And, you know, even in the both movies play with the idea of non-human intelligences being a foe versus being an ally. Because in the first movie, we're going to spoil Alien as well now, but in the first movie, the android is ultimately the vessel for like all the demise, because he's been told that this infection is good and we need to bring this alien back to research. We wonder if Bishop is going to be the same, and Ripley is reasonably suspicious, and then he winds up being redeemed over the course of it and saving the day. And then the human, Paul Reiser, is ultimately the one who's going to make the more villainous choices. And I think it's just so interesting to see, like, you know, the unexpected monster, and that Alien took a more easy choice, that it's anything not human is not to be trusted. And Aliens tells us some non-humans are trustworthy, some are going to kill you, some humans are trustworthy, some humans are going to kill you. And it's a more moderate way of looking at it, I think.
Well, to make it even more complicated, in a scene that happens shortly after all of this, the crew is sort of together and discovering that there's a whole bunch of eggs where the facehuggers are coming out of, and they're discussing like what they're going to do about it. And Ripley says something to the crew like, "Each one of these things comes from an egg, right? So who's laying these eggs?" And I thought it was such an interesting way for her to state that, because she doesn't say it. She says who. And it's a choice, clearly, because in the next line, basically, Bishop, who is not human, corrects her and says, "Well, we haven't seen it yet." And I'm wondering, like, what does that choice of Ripley saying who, and in a sense, like humanizing the creatures, what does that do to us as an audience, do you think? Is it just revealing something about Ripley's character? Is it trying to have us relate to what ultimately we learn is a mother alien who's trying to protect her young? Like, what do you think's going on there?
What's delightful about the final sequence is the whole colony is going to melt down, the nuclear reaction is going to happen, and you have to get off within a few minutes, which totally parallels the first movie. But the alien mother is really trying to survive. Like, it's a race to get to the ship in order to escape as well. And, you know, killing them, if that comes along the way, that's fine. But it's really, you could sense this creature does not want to be destroyed and wants to survive. And what is more relatable or universal than that instinct? It's something that we all share. I hadn't noticed that moment of kind of giving that alien, giving her like a more generous pronoun, or using who. I think that's a really amazing moment. And, you know, I don't know if you've read Braiding Sweetgrass, the book by Robin Wall Kimmerer, but she talks a lot about, she's a botanist, and she comes from a native tribe where the way that they talk about animals is all through animate pronouns and never through inanimate pronouns. So that it's always a he or a she, and it's unfathomable within that grammatical construction to ever say it for an animal. And she points out how ludicrous or harmful it would be if we talked about humans that way. You know, if you said, there's a grandmother in the kitchen, it is stirring the soup. Like, it just makes us feel like, what? No, you can't do that. But we do it regularly for even animals that we love. Like, we give pets he and she, but we don't. Like a squirrel running across a park, we don't say he or she, we say it. And I think it's an interesting moment of elevating the alien status from inanimate setting that wants to kill you into character with motivations and drives and needs. Ultimately, like, who's as badass as Ripley? I think you would say, Dan, Newt, but I would say that the one that's vying for that role is this alien mother, who is showing such resourceful abilities at the end, and actually can't be taken down by a person, needs to be taken down by a person who's in a giant yellow, you know, mechanized device. That's the only way Ripley can counter her, is like with extra help. Yeah. Which makes her kind of an android, right? That puts her sort of in the Bishop role.
Absolutely.
And she has to become more than human in order to defeat this alien. And so it's, those themes are just working together in so many interesting ways.
No, they really are. And the whole question of motherhood and the theme of motherhood that sort of comes through the entirety of the film. Like, Ripley starts off as a childless cat lady.
Topical. Nice one.
And we love that. But we see her character arc throughout the film sort of change from first encountering Newt and sort of feeling very aggressive. We have to save her, go get her. And like, there's like nothing kind or tender about the way that she's speaking there, to, you know, having sort of this funny moment where she's trying to comfort Newt and saying, you know, Newt's like, I always have these bad dreams. And Ripley's like, well, look at Casey, you know, look inside. There's no bad dreams inside Casey's head. And Newt's like, Ripley, Casey's a doll. And it's like this kind of like sheepish look, like, oh yeah, I tried to be mothering, but I failed. And you're right.
I've often had those experiences where, like, I get the kid's age slightly wrong, you know, I'm like, ooh, you know, what does your doggy think of the movie? And he's like, my doggy is a stuffed animal. Like, it doesn't have any opinions on this movie.
It's so accurate. It's these little moments of like human relation that sort of ground this really wild, bombastic scenario and make the film work.
Yeah. I found
make the film work for me.
Alien Romulus is the latest Alien movie, and I found it was the first one to actually kind of get back to that human element in a substantial way, and I really loved that moment. Alien 3 came after Aliens, and that one I was so traumatized by Aliens, even though Alien 3 came out when I was in 8th grade, so much older and potentially ready to watch it. I didn't want to watch it. I got the novelization from the public library and read the novelization of Alien 3 instead of watching that movie.
Damn.
Yes. But that way I could talk about it at the lunch table in school, right?
There you go.
I wouldn't be left out. I would have things to say.
Was the novelization good, or was it, you know?
I don't know, looking back, if I would think it was
or
good
was it
now.
or was it like Alien 3? Have you gone back and watched Alien 3?
I have. Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's put a pin in that.
Let's talk
because later. I have something to say actually, and it sort of jumps off of what just talking about, like Ripley's motherhood arc here. You know, she goes from this like sort of like trying to have these caregiver feelings to ultimately becoming the ultimate protector for this young girl, going off by herself into the bowels of this reactor where Newt has been kidnapped and taken by some of the alien drones so that Newt can spawn yet another one of them. Ripley sort of goes nuclear, and it becomes the ultimate protector. And especially at the end of the movie is like one of the best lines in any movie ever, when the mother alien has crept up into the ship with them, and Ripley has to put on the exoskeleton lifter costume to fight. And she comes out and she's like, Ripley says to the alien mother, "Get away from her, you bitch." It's such a change from not knowing what to do with a kid to trying really hard to be that caregiver to the ultimate, I'm gonna like protect and be fierce.
Yeah.
And it echoes what the alien queen mother does for her own kids.
Yeah.
Like, Ripley eviscerates them with her flamethrower. She destroys all the eggs. And so I agree with you partly that the alien queen is trying to survive, but I also do think part of it is revenge. She's like, I'm gonna kill you. You get away from her, you bitch. You get away from my little eggs, you bitch.
Yeah.
You
Well,
know?
and I was gonna like a hyper feminized way of revenge,
Yes.
right? Like, and how often in an action movie do you wind up with a triad of three female figures who are really, you know, one Newt is one that's vulnerable, but the other two are fighting each other over, you know, protecting their offspring, these female offspring. And it's true to the sort of hive dynamics that you'd have these female creatures, just like wasps and ants, were predominantly female, who are raising offspring through eggs and often predators and parasites, which those animals are. And like Hicks should be the action hero for this movie, right? But he gets wounded and he's in the kind of damsel in distress role for a lot of it, right? It's really about, you know, Ripley is kind of in charge figuring things out. And especially for the 80s, I think it was such a great flipping of this, like what you could call like push me pull you dynamics in thrillers, where it would be like the woman would be like half fainting and like dragged by her wrist by the male protagonist throughout the course of the movie as she's like running and stumbling and trying to get away from the aggressors. And here we have a really great female agent in charge, which I think adds to the sort of subtly transgressive qualities of the movie.
Yeah. And I think as kids watching this, you know, it's kind of a cool thing to be able to see, like that kind of transgression of the tropes and what we traditionally would have seen before this. It's like these people were trying to do something different and new, and what a great way for us to be introduced to these elements of horror by seeing this strong female energy, these very real characters trying to survive and fight to the death. And that last scene is so intense, so terrifying. I've found even last night when I was rewatching it, I was like clutching the armrest on the chair. I was holding my breath. Still, it's still that effective.
Yeah. One of the things my least favorite thing in the first movie is at the end when Ripley's finally making her escape. She doesn't yet know that there's an alien on board of her escape pod, but she kind of just strips down to like a tiny tank top and underwear. And this whole scene, like she's been this kind of amazing sexless protagonist the whole way through, and it turns very, very male gazy. I mean, there's plausible reasons that she would need to strip down, but all of a sudden she is this, you know, her body and the camera is just staring at it very closely. And I was like, it was a reminder of like, oh yes, we were in this like sort of isolated position in which the female body could just be a thing of power and authority. And then it becomes this sort of subject of this sexualized gaze of the camera. And like the reminder that like the outside world, like, oh yes, we can't just live in this empowered female zone. And I think the Aliens never quite puts Ripley in that situation. I mean, she's obviously strong and beautiful and very compelling to watch, but never this kind of sexy bedroomy image. And I love that about her, but without desexing her either, because as you say, like motherhood is all throughout this movie, and is very much her position as a woman is very important to Aliens.
Speaking of mothers, I sort of want to give you the opportunity a little bit to talk about your books. Definitely don't want to go too much into them, and I'll let you sort of steer the ship. But do you feel like the idea of mothers sort of comes up in your books? In Outer Space, is a mother, the idea of a mother, a comfort? Or even the idea of family in general, like, you know, with your characters traveling very far away in isolation. Like, how do you feel about that?
You know, thinking about Aliens in the context of this recent pair of books that I put out, I sort of did think about like how might the fingerprints of Aliens sort of be on the work that I've created. And I think in Darkness Outside Us, there is this similar give and take around whether artificial intelligences are going to be a thing of betrayal or salvation. In Darkness Outside Us, the operating system of the ship is lying to these boys about their true mission in a way that ultimately is very, very bad for them for the majority of the book. But once their goals align with the ship and they actually have realized the true mission, then the operating system is actually a source of help and support and life preservation for them. And I think in the second book, it also follows a similar trajectory. And I think there's a way in which these android figures in Alien and Aliens are also ways of looking at, like Terminator suggests, like, which is also James Cameron, but suggests that we have like Skynet will take over and that humans are no more and they want to destroy us. Then Aliens actually says something more complicated around these artificial creations. And I think I'm kind of interested in being in conversation in these books with what we've already interpreted as sci-fi readers and watchers of what computers will do. And there's also kind of the specter of like HAL 9000 beneath it all of this, that the computer might run amok and to save the mission will sacrifice people, which Alien and Aliens were also really interested in. But I think I find sci-fi, I've often resisted sci-fi books because they can be a little bit chilly, like much more interested in the intellectual questions it's raising and not the emotional life of the characters. They can feel a little juiceless sometimes, I think. And I was very interested in writing like a very emotional science fiction book with Darkness Outside Us. And I think trying to like get more human elements in was a key part of that. So in the original draft of the book, the mission of the boys is to like investigate a mysterious signal that's appeared on the edge of the solar system. And then I gave that draft to a friend to read, and she said, "What if there's something more human about that?" And so that's when I revise it, like they're rescuing one of their sisters who's stranded on this colony. And then the operating system, the idea of like having it be Ambrose's mother is the voice of this operating system. I'm always trying to figure out ways to get out characters' backstory without dumping exposition on the reader. And it was a way to have, he's constantly in conversation with someone who is not his mother. And so his reactions, he's able to like sort of organically have all his mommy feelings come out when he's talking to the ship without having to like take a page and say like Ambrose and his mother always had a complicated relationship and blah, blah, blah. So it's just a way to have a reminder of it.
Oh, that's very clever. And the way that you've set it up and ultimately how it plays out. And we talked earlier about whether or not or how these books are, how they have horror or horrific elements. Did you set out to create scenes of extreme tension and terror, or did the story just bring you to those places? Because my reaction to these books was all over the place. I had emotions. You had me tearing up, like probably bawling a little bit, and also like pulling my hair out, trying to like, I was really scared. You really did something really remarkable. What you have done with these books is beyond comprehension to me.
Oh, damn. Thanks.
Did the plot just necessitate the horror elements, or did you plan on those things happening?
So I had this conception of, well, the very origin of Darkness Outside Us was I was watching What Lies Beneath, this kind of forgettable romantic thriller with Michelle Pfeiffer and Harrison Ford. And true confessions, I was drunk watching this movie. I was in college and I hatched a plot halfway through. I was not following what was going on. And I was like, the only way I can make this movie make sense is if there's like 10 different Michelle Pfeiffers and there's not just one. And like, so that's why she can be in all these places at once. That's not true in the movie. It's not true. But I lodged that in my mind. I was like, I kind of liked my version of this. That idea of the horror of thinking that your unique self, that one that you believe to be really the only living, feeling thing in the world, right? Like we all have this, like, who else has an interior experience of the world? Like we can intellectually know that other beings do, but like I'm the only one that I know for sure is actually real. Like you could be made up. But then to see a copy of yourself that also believes that's the real one is, I think, deeply, deeply horrifying and would point to that, like that base level of what you think is true and real and what it means to be alive is not actually right. But I think there's like from Agatha Christie on, there's a way in which thrillers to create tension, like close the set, you can't leave. So you're on an island and the ship won't come to pick anyone up until the next morning. Or think about like The Shining, you have this hotel that gets snowed in. There is no getting off out of the Overlook Hotel and leaving. And so then everything that happens, like the stakes just double, right? Because you can't just hail an Uber and get out of there. And like a spaceship is the most extreme version, because at least on the island you could swim off. At least at the Overlook you could try to make it through the snow, even if you were going to die. And they do try to get snowmobiles, I think, to get out of it. But in space you can't do it. In space no one can hear you scream, and you cannot leave. So there is no opening the hatch and finding out what's true or getting out of there. And that's both horrifying, I think, because the ship is in utter control. Spoiler, sorry. But you also, it's also horrifying because for me, that like romantic feeling of like they fall in love, these two boys, but there is no one that can ask about like, am I crazy or is he being weird? Like there's no one except that other person to navigate, and there's no break from it. And, I think that could also be this source of tension and fear for the two characters. But it's funny how it like, that's sort of on the conceptual level. Like, so it's not scene by scene trying to build in horror and tension. It's just happened in premise, and then I just had characters doing the thing in the premise, and the premise took care of all the horror parts, I guess.
Well, that answers my question, and I think that's a really cool answer. Now, in terms of creating a sequel to this book, which I couldn't even imagine before I read The Brightness Between Us, like where you were going to take this next, thinking of sequels and Aliens as a sequel, and the sequel to Aliens being Alien 3. What are your thoughts on the existence of this movie, Aliens? Did Alien need a sequel? And then how do you feel about Alien 3 and what happens immediately at the beginning of Alien 3, which when I think about and I watching the end of Aliens, it makes me so upset.
Yeah, it's been a long time. Given your love for Newt.
Oh my God. For people who aren't aware of what I'm talking about, the beginning of Alien 3, before any action happens, Ripley crash lands on another planet and Michael Baine's character and Newt are killed. And so everything that they went through in Aliens feels like it was for naught. And watching the end of Aliens, which is so sweet, these moments between Ripley and Newt feeling like mother and daughter, finally. Newt actually at the very end, when she is reunited after the big blowout with the Queen Alien, grabs Ripley and says like, "Mommy," which, oh my God, knowing what was coming next as the credits were rolling, I started crying. I was like, I can't believe they did that.
Wow. Yeah. I never thought
what do you
it.
think? What do you think about these as sequels? What do you think is Aliens as a sequel to Alien? Is it necessary? Is it better?
Yeah.
Just is it the same movie?
I have lots of thoughts.
With bigger effects?
Lots of thoughts. One is, to pick up on Alien 3, I do think they probably had the instinct to like clear the decks, like to take a narrative accumulates noise as it goes, right? So by the end of Aliens, we have all these sort of complicated, nuanced relationships now between Hicks and Ripley and Newt. And if you clear the decks and wipe the slate, then you can have all the playground for your new story and the new character arcs and the new relationships. So I can see them clearing the decks. You can also imagine like a producer getting off the phone, like, we can't get Michael Bain for Alien 3. Call the screenwriter. Like, okay, we'll kill him. Like, where's Carrie Henn? I don't know. She's too expensive. But they even did it after the end of Alien, right? She had the orange cat, and then the orange cat in Aliens, like she just leaves it behind. Doesn't want to take it on to the new planet, which it's good cat ownership. It's being a good cat lady. Any cat lady would make the same choice. I actually think that one of the reasons I think Aliens was on my mind is that it is the ultimate example to me of how a sequel is done right. Because Alien had such a contained, beautiful world. It did not end on any sort of cliffhanger or the need for continuing the story. And so I'm sure viewers were like, I'm a little worried about having a sequel to this. It doesn't call for it, and it's a cynical cash in. And they know, I know, I want the same experience. Like, I love this thing. I'm lining up to get the sequel. I want the same experience. But if I get the same experience, I'm going to be like, it's kind of like a rehash. It's a little boring, right? So that is what the creators of a sequel, or when I was thinking Brightness Between Us, what I was contending with is this feeling of wanting something that would live up to the original. But if you give them the original, it's not actually what they wanted, even though they thought they did. And I think that's something that you can feel them playing around with the Alien and Aliens. And their solution, I mean, you can see the plot beats are very, very similar between the two in one way, right? You have slow exposure to these aliens, slow increase in menace, face huggers first, one alien at a time, and then you have the grand attack, and then this intimate, just Ripley and just an alien in close combat where it's more intense than ever before at the conclusion, and then safety. Like that same arc happens.
Yeah.
But in Alien, it operated through slasher movie rules. Like they get isolated into individual parts of the ship. They are taken down one by one. And we wind up with just the final girl surviving. And then Aliens didn't follow slasher movie rules. I don't know if you would agree or not. I think it felt much more like a war movie to me, like this expedition into the unknown. And you still do have people being killed, but you have this like sense of overwhelming power on one side that is slowly eroded. The human power is slowly eroded until they are left vulnerable, and the enemy forces can overcome them. But it just feels all the pieces are there. The number of characters, the kind of like types of personality, the alien menace is the same, but it changed the narrative underlying structure to something else. And I think that gave you both, right? It gave you the Alien experience, but it didn't give a movie that operated like Alien did. And I think that was such a brilliant move on James Cameron's part in the conceiving of Aliens. And I thought it was I was like, hats off. So when I was thinking about Brightness Between Us, I was thinking like, how can I look at these questions of how do you find meaning when the world around you isn't what you thought and you can't trust it? How do you find meaning? And to me, the answer is somewhere like human intimacy, like that, this connection with us and other people. And I wanted to continue that theme, but I knew if I just did like a day 2 sequel, like it was just the very next day, settling this foreign colony on a distant planet, that it would be either boring or feel very familiar. And so I just made the choice to like, we're going to jump ahead 16 years. And unlike the first book, we're going to have 2 different storylines. And one is back on Earth tens of thousands of years earlier. And then the current storyline, and they're going to interweave, which the first book was very straightforward in the way it was told. It was just a first person point of view, solid the whole way through. And this one instead is like weaving 4 different points of view, just so that way I could tell a similar story, but it wouldn't feel like the same book, just trying to thread that needle. And so that's why I was on tenterhooks waiting for it to come out, for people to be like either enraged or like, oh, this wasn't the book I thought I was getting, but I'm glad I got it. Like that was my goal, is to like hopefully get that. But I was also well aware that people might be just infuriated that it did not feel like the first book did.
I loved it. And I loved it for all of those reasons that you just said. It's so moving. I can't go into why, but again, bawling.
Bawling's a strong verb.
I think I've just been I think I've just been very sensitive, and emotions are raw lately. So, it's not all you, but it was a lot of you. There was a lot of what you did and what you were able to put together. And it really was about the relationships and the emotions there, and just thoughts of, let's just say, big, scary thoughts about the way the world is working and where we're headed now.
Yeah. This question of like, should humans continue to survive? Like, I don't think it's an easy answer to that question.
This is literally, I have on my notes, I have end with this, this next question. And I wanted to talk to you about the idea of hope and hope for the planet, our planet, and how the stories that you're telling with darkness outside us and the brightness between us, do you believe personally is leaving the answer to long-term survival of humanity?
Golly.
Leaving and finding another place, colonizing another planet like they do in Aliens?
Aren't you supposed to finish with like a lightning round? Like, what's your favorite food?
No, it's going to get darker.
Not on our first fears, Eliot. Not on our first fears. I really, really, really hope we don't manage to settle off Earth. I have very little faith that we will find a way to be better stewards wherever our next place is. And if we manage to spread and be in 2 places, then the next time it's 4 and 8 and 16. And we have this creep of what we've done to our natural resources on this planet happening in many exponentially growing numbers of other planets. So I was actually talking to a friend a few months ago, and I forget how we got on this. We were just like shooting the breeze, and we were like, if you were an arch villain, like what sort of arch villain would you be? And I was like, without a beat, I was like, eco-terrorist. Like, So if you right now put on my screen a red button I could click that would just sort of painlessly make all humans vanish from the earth and just leave it to the beavers and the manatees and the ants, like I would click. I would click it right away, which I realize
Wow.
is not the moralistic worldview of most people. So I don't. I am, I'm in Brightness Between Us. I'm really interested in looking at is maybe the moral thing to stop us from being able to spread.
Mm-hmm.
And I have characters who believe that and characters who don't.
Yeah.
And so good thing is I can, my job as a writer is to raise interesting questions, not to answer them. And in fact, the moment I'm answering them is when the book gets bad. I have to like, okay, peel it back, Eliot. Like you can't propose answers. Just raise the questions and make people decide for themselves. But there's not a resolved question in my mind about whether we deserve to keep going.
Sort of an offshoot of that, and one of the reasons we maybe don't deserve to keep going. Some of us believe that corporations are people. Do you think, corporations play a big role in the Alien franchise and also in your books? Do you think that corporations will ever become capable of understanding that it's in their interest to keep us alive?
No. I wish, Dan. I know you wanted a note of hope.
No, I'm seriously just want to know what you think.
Oh gosh, I don't.
Yeah,
I think you'd have to have a new way of structuring corporations on the foundational level to make them function differently. But the idea, even the ones that start off for good, slowly as financial interests get heavier and people removed from boards and new people come on, it just becomes more about shareholder value. And like that is so just embedded in the structure of how we run things that I think if it was a corporation that operated for good, it just wouldn't be called a corporation. It would be something else. But I do believe that, we see the diminishment of the national space programs and the rise of corporate space programs now. And I think that is a trend that I think is very likely to continue, and that we'll see it's not a national project anymore. It's a financial corporate one. And part of the world building and Brightness Between Us was thinking about like, how will that express itself? So there's, pleasure satellites where you can throw a giant quinceanera on a pleasure satellite and invite all your friends. And, like what is the corporate version of space exploration?
I mean, the way that you build it out, it sounds like it could be a lot of fun too.
Totally.
Maybe it's not all bad.
Yeah.
I guess to kind of wrap this up in a two-part question, do you think, is the survival of our species of humanity a great unifier? Does it even matter if we survive when our time on this planet is finite? And at the risk of sounding overly bleak, why have hope for us surviving at all if you believe that's true?
Good night, folks. It's been fun. As a hurricane bears down on my location right now, Dan. The real gift you just gave me. Okay, so I will say there is a Carl Sagan quote that I love very much, known as Pale Blue Dot, and it's just a paragraph. But he talks about the experience of the first time we saw Earth from the outside after we went into orbit in the 60s. And you could see that it was this little blue marble in this vast, dark expanse. And instead of being all of the universe, it just felt like this little tiny, tiny place that was so fragile. And, he goes on to say that all the things that seem to matter so much, kings and queens, pandemics, your personal goals and aspirations and your losses and your griefs and the wonderful joys you've had, are just really tiny when you think they were on this like chunk of rock orbiting around this gaseous ball in a small part of a galaxy that's a small part of the universe. And instead of being desolating or feeling like that means life is meaningless, to me, that just feels like it's really kind of calming. My husband and I, we realized at one point that he's the exuberant pessimist. Like he's really high energy, but he thinks everything's going to shit. And I'm the melancholy optimist where I'm really low energy. I'm like, okay. But I basically think everything's going to be fine because it doesn't matter. Because it's all like, we're all just like a tiny lifespan on this rock, and it's all fine. I mean, like it doesn't matter if, something terrible happens to me because my life didn't matter much anyway. Like it's actually like a source of calmness and happiness to me. It's I don't know. It's weird.
I think that's fair. I really do. And, you know, like not that I would give everything up for myself or the people I love right now either, but I think one of the things that people struggle with so much is, will I go on? Will I matter? You know, this, all that. Whereas like, if we know that our time is finite, if we know that the sun is going to, you know, go supernova one day, we'll probably be gone long before that ever happens, then it's all about the choices we make today, right?
Yeah.
And I think that that's a pretty hopeful statement.
Yeah. Doesn't it make you kind of want to go more softly with other people, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Not to give anything away, but some of the characters in your sequel, like, what do they do with their own limited time? You know, it's like they connect, and I think that that's important. It's like that's what we can do.
Yeah, there's I forget where I was reading it, but about someone who was on their deathbed and was just like, I just wish I'd taken the plastic off the couch. You know, just like let the couch be dirty so I could enjoy the couch and not get plastic on it. And I think that's sort of like a metaphor for how to be. You know, like don't fuss, just aim into generosity and connection and keeping open to each other.
I love that. And I think that's a perfect way to sort of end this chat about aliens and monsters and humans and what it means to be all of those things. So
it's been such a joy, Dan.
Thank you.
Thanks for this conversation. It's been great.
Thank you so much for joining me. And this is the first conversation I've recorded in almost a year, and it makes me want to do more. So thanks for making me feel good about it.
Bring it on. Thanks for the opportunity. And thanks for, I think, lessening some of the deeply embedded trauma that aliens produced in me by airing it and talking about it and discussing. It's like exposure therapy.
Thanks again to Eliot Schrefer for the chat. Once more, his newest novels, The Darkness Outside Us and The Brightness Between Us, are must-reads for fans of any genre. I tried to edit out big spoilers for both books in the chat, since so much of the pleasure of reading them comes from the surprises that Eliot builds into his narratives, which are brilliant. Just brilliant. And if you do pick them up, I think it's best to go in not knowing much. Or at least not knowing much more than we've already both spoiled for you during this chat. Please subscribe to Our First Fears wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you like, you can follow our social media where you can find it at Our First Fears, one word. If you want to get in touch, let me know. Have you ever shouted, "Get away from her, you bitch," at your enemies? Thanks again for your precious time. I'm Dan Poblocki, wishing you sweet dreams and pleasant nightmares.